We've got a question from the Terrar. Terrar? Terror. I'm not sure how to pronounce that screen name. But the Terrar says, do you think Gilbert Burns can beat Usman? Yes, and I also think Usman can beat Gilbert Burns. That could go either way. We can make all kinds of arguments for that. But I'm not going to. There's a second question here, which I think is much more interesting to me. What is your opinion on UFC fighters' pay? Ooh, man, that's an issue that has come up again recently. And the UFC has notoriously, through the years, grossly underpaid their fighters, in my opinion. Now, this has changed a lot over the years. It's gotten a little better in some cases over the years and a little worse in other cases over the years. I'll give you a few examples. About, 13, 14 years ago, an entry-level contract in the UFC was basically a 3-fight deal. You would be paid $3,000 to show, an additional $3,000 to win. If you won your 3 fights, you would be eligible to renew that contract, but the UFC held the right to cut you at any time for any reason. And so essentially you could fight once in the entire year. So you had fighters having the potential to make $9,000 total if they won every single one of their fights, if they were lucky enough to get all 3 fights in 1 year. But more often than not, they got that 1 fight. And many of those guys got cut even after winning. So, yeah, man, not the greatest deal. And so a lot of guys back then, just like today, had this idea, oh, I'm going to make it in the UFC, then I'm going to make all this money. And I knew some of these guys, and the smart ones did not give up their day jobs, even the ones that made it. Unfortunately, most professional fighters have to work full-time jobs to make ends meet. That's a sobering reality for a lot of casual fans who have no idea. Now, a lot of the mid-tier UFC fighters back then, this was before the Reebok deal, the very controversial Reebok deal where Reebok became the sole sponsor of the UFC. Back then, in the 3,000 to show, 3,000 to win era, and even when that pay scale went up a bit, most fighters were making most of their money not from the fight purses, but from sponsors. They would get sponsors to pay them handsomely or pay them whatever they could to put their name on a banner they would throw over the side of the cage as Bruce Buffer was announcing their name, or logos to wear on their shorts. And a lot of fighters would basically pay the bills that way. And the Reebok deal cut that out. No more sponsorships in the cage on the shorts except for Reebok and Reebok alone. And people were understandably upset. This was countered with the argument, going down the Hegelian dialectic route here. Argument, counter-argument. The UFC countered this argument by saying, hey, Reebok will now sponsor the fighters. So now each fighter will get an additional sponsorship from Reebok. There were fighters before who couldn't get any sponsors or didn't get very many sponsors, and this is helping them out. Whereas the guys who got a lot of sponsors and who were doing really well in the sponsorship game were quite upset about this, understandably so. So now the pay scale has changed. I'm not sure exactly how it works. I believe entry-level fighters get more than $3,000 a show. But again, the UFC still reserves rights to cut fighters at any time for any reason, because reasons, yeah. They want to make money as much as possible. So they got to put on the fights that are the biggest draws. And if you're not a good draw, yeah, they don't want you to work for them. That makes sense. That is their right as a business. Okay. Ooh, what happened there? So a lot of fighters are still wondering, what do we do? What do we do? Man, Wonderboy Thompson, he had the right idea. A while back, he started his own YouTube channel. And capitalized on the fact that there are a ton of karate nerds, traditional martial arts nerds out there on the internet looking for role models, looking for guys who practice karate, who practice traditional martial arts, but who also are badass cage fighters and have competed in the UFC at the highest level. And so he started this YouTube channel, and almost as soon as he did, boom, it blew up a little bit. And so Wonderboy Thompson is in a unique position where he can have this additional revenue stream independent of the UFC. He can have additional sponsors independent of the UFC, and that is very smart. Now, my advice for young aspiring fighters who want to be the next UFC champion, or really my advice for anyone regardless of what your field of expertise is or what your future job aspirations are, diversify your income streams. Meaning have more than one source of income. So, Wonderboy Thompson, he had a good run in the UFC. He's doing all right in the UFC. Will that always be the case? No, eventually he's going to retire, or he's going to have to retire, or maybe the UFC is going to cut him eventually because the next best thing is going to come along. Who knows? That could happen. Anything could happen. So again, he's doing the smart thing. He's diversifying his income streams. Social media is a fascinating outlet to do that, especially if you already have fame. If you don't have fame, as far as YouTube and Instagram and all these other potential sources of income go, you have to claw your way up. You got to work at it. If you want to get like 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, on average, you got to put out something like at least 1,000 videos. If you made like 5 or 6 videos and you're wondering, why don't I have 100,000 subscribers yet? Because you haven't been doing very much. There are some YouTube moguls out there who got really lucky, and somehow everything they put out is an instant hit, but that's the rare exception and not the norm. If you want a big following, generally you have to grind at it, right? But if you have fame from outside of a social media platform, like say if you are a top contender in the UFC, if you're a famous actor or something like that, then boom, you can diversify your income fairly quickly through social media. If you are on social media and you're wondering, man, what else can I do? Oh man, well, there are sponsors. You can seek them out. Sometimes they seek you out. You can diversify, go into podcasts. It is amazing how many people just love to listen to other people talk. And you might think I don't have anything interesting to say. Have you ever watched a popular YouTube video or listened to a popular podcast and just thought, I'm not interested in this at all. I wonder why anybody is. Well, guess what? It's because people have very diverse interests. And there's a group of people out there that probably wants to listen to what you have to say, as long as you polish your craft enough that you're good at saying it. Going back to the UFC. Fighters have been talking about unionizing. We need to unionize. Will that ever happen? I don't know. Getting a union going when there is already a powerful corporate entity in place which is opposed to a union is very difficult. I used to work for Nestle, the food production company. I worked in one of their factories. And Nestle is very anti-union. And they have the power, the economic power, to shut down the formation of workers' unions. And so when workers attempt to unionize, they shut that down very quickly. Now, when we're talking about smaller organizations, sure, you can build up unions. You can make that stuff happen. When the workers actually have the power to pull the strings and not the other way around. In the case of the UFC has all the cards. they have all the power. How many UFC fighters are there on the roster right now? I don't know. I read the number the other day. It's not a huge number. It's a couple hundred fighters, active fighters on the roster. How many professional MMA fighters, active MMA fighters, are there in the world right now? Well, there are tens of thousands of active, professional, fairly high-level fighters that could fill those spots at any moment. And so the UFC has the power. If every fighter on the roster got together and said, hey, powers that be, Dana White, etc., we're all going on strike unless you accept our terms and allow us to unionize and meet our demands. And the UFC has the power to say, nope, breach of contract, you're all gone. Next. And then they would fill those 200, 300, 400 spots, whatever they are, instantly with the next group of young up-and-comers who want their chance. Because where are these fighters coming from? Man, I got to tell you, when I started fighting professionally, my first professional combat sport was kickboxing. My second was Muay Thai. My third was MMA. But the paychecks back then were low. They were very, very low. My first paycheck for a professional fight was $50 to show. And the win bonus was $50. The highest paycheck I got for American kickboxing was $350. That was including the win bonus. Chuck Liddell wrote in his autobiography, Iceman, about how when he won a world championship fight in American kickboxing, he won exactly $500. So, man, I wasn't that far from world champion money as far as American kickboxing was concerned. But, yeah, times have changed. Paychecks, for the most part, have gone up, but not by that much. So you still have guys scrapping in clubs, scrapping in dive bars with a ring or a cage set up in the middle. These are professional fights, not amateurs. But they're set up in very seedy, almost amateurish conditions. And they are fighting for pennies. They're fighting for scraps. And these guys are thinking, oh man, I would give anything for a shot at the big show to be on the UFC roster. And so if the UFC dumped every one of their fighters, they have the economic power, they have the pull, they have the influence to replace every last one of those guys. I know some of those guys, like, say, Conor McGregor, they like to think they're irreplaceable, but are they really? When was the last time Conor fought? He doesn't fight very often, man. But he has this air of, I'm irreplaceable. There's nobody like me but me. And okay, we're all special little snowflakes in our own special way. Great, I'll give you that. But every UFC fight card that doesn't have Conor McGregor on it has replaced him. And they're still making money. So that is the unfortunate reality of it. In a perfect world, how would it be? An organization would take care of their fighters, make sure that they were paid a living wage, make sure that they had not just adequate health care, but good health care, man. In a perfect world, a fight organization would take care of the fighters. Because you think, without these guys, we don't have a show, except in the back of the mind of the promoters, they know. For every one of these guys that drops out, every one of these guys that doesn't make it, every one of these guys we cut, there's 10,000 more behind them waiting to fill that spot. And until that changes, until professional fighters start making more money outside of the UFC, they're not going to be making more money inside of the UFC. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.